A very good evening to all of you. And, today I'm feeling a lot better. I finished my quarantine, and just last week, I was saying good evening to everyone while it was a good morning for me. But now I'm on the same page as all of you. And it gives me a lot of happiness that we have Dr. Manju Kak today. She will be talking about they who walk the mountains, the Bhotias, the traders, and their trade with Tibetan salt. A very fascinating topic. But before I give the mic to Dr. Kak today, I would like to introduce her formally to all of you. Uh, Dr. Manju Kak is a teacher, an author, critic, and academician in history, art, and culture, whose work has a special focus on the mountains. That's why we are here to hear her today. This brought her to the doorstep of Rorik heritage and the philosophy of Agni Yoga through a labor of love, a book, Nicholas Rorik, A Quest and a Legacy. The outcome in an international seminar and an exhibition on the Rorik Peace Pact at the Jamia University, New Delhi. I'm sure a lot of you may be envious of me right now because I am sitting right opposite the mountain where Nicholas Rorik's trust is. This valley is beautiful, and I can only imagine that why Dr. Kak wouldn't work on Nicholas Rorik's legacy. Through word, image, research, or curatorial theme, she has always intensely explored some unique aspect of Himalayan life to enhance the understanding of India's cultural diversity, which is instrumental in building peaceful societies through the understanding of the other. Her film, a documentary film, on the which is based on the talk today, "They Who Walk the Mountains," on erstwhile Indo-Tibetan salt trade as a binding factor between the Himalayan communities. We will post the link for the documentary, post the talk, so that all of you can really see the visuals that are, really stunning and create that impact. That you can really see who these people were, what is it all about. An ethnographic exhibition she conducted on the Kashmiri Pandits, a vintage album, The Making of Modern India. As a painter, her last show was Rani Khet's State of Mind. Her PhD explores the sociology of culture through the prism of the iconography of wood carving in the Himalayas and is from the National Museum, New Delhi. And I really like the fact that the iconography of wood carving, wood is such an important medium in the Himalayas. And right now I'm teaching a workshop on Hindu and Buddhist iconography in the Western Himalayas, along with my team, Ekta and Abira Bhattacharya of the National Museum. So I'm so happy to learn that you have explored that medium. Her latest book, In the Shadow of the Devi on Kumaon Himalayas, typifies this. Her three collections of short fiction have won critical acclaim, including the Katha Award and the British Council Prize. They include First Light in Colonel Pura, a Penguin publication, Requiem for an Unsung Revolutionary, Ravi Dayal, and Just One Life and Other Stories. She has been awarded the Charles Wallace Fellowship to the University of Stirling, United Kingdom, the Hawthornden Fellowship, Edinburgh, and is the recipient of the Senior Fellowship in Culture by the Government of India. She has presented papers and participated in many conferences in India and overseas: Almaty, London, Edinburgh, New York, Montreal, Moscow. She's been a teacher, a visiting professor at important centers, learning centers in India and abroad, and has organized conferences. Her commitment to social justice has been through 2 decades of engagement through workshops, seminars, research, and activism, in voluntary work with a focus on peace and women's rights as a member of All India Women's Conference, which was established in 1927 with a membership of 100,000 women, and the Geneva based International Alliance of Women, established in 1904. Through journalism in print, and as a commentator on national TV channels like Republic TV. Of course, Republic TV does very good work as well. Okay. It's not all about Sushant Singh Rajput, it's about meaningful work. News X and Times Now. She's a trustee of the Lal Bahadur Shastri Memorial Trust, named after the former Indian Prime Minister, and member of important bodies as the Indian National Trust of Architecture, Cultural Heritage, India International Center, and Indian Association of Women Studies. It is so wonderful that on this forum we get to meet stalwarts in their field, like Dr. Manju Kak, who can share their experiences of their research at a very personal level. And with the COVID thing, I'm so glad that technology has really brought us all together in these little windows where we can explore and travel and be with each other without actually being there. So, having introduced you, Dr. Manju Kak, please lead us into your world of they who walked the mountains.
Thank you, Sonali. You have uh, sort of wrapped me up in this highfalutin introduction, but my work is very humble and it's of a very small community. But I do like to think that it is, though it is iconoclastic, it is a metaphor, or you may say it is emblematic of some of the larger issues that are confronting us today, not only as a country with its political problems and challenges, but as a civilization as a whole, and even for that matter, in the context of the issues of peace and coexistence in the world at large. So, work like mine, which is very small and minuscule, has an impactful kind of effect that would set us thinking as to what is the nature of human relationships, what is the nature of our existence and bonding with each other, and also what would be the path forward. I am involved in a few peace initiatives for the NGO with which I do voluntary work, the All India Women's Conference. And through this exploration, one is trying to arrive at an understanding of we, men and women of this country, India, what are we all about and where do we want to go? Having said that, I will be sharing with you my screen, which has some photographs. Unfortunately, they're not of the documentary, which maps out in detail the route and what occurs during trade, but they are taken of the region and give you a flavor of that part of the world. May I just start off with an anecdote that my mountain guide, Durga Singh Rawat, who took me down this trek of 56 or 63 or something kilometers, talking to me all along the way, as guides are wont. But later he let slip that he was actually one of the descendants of the famous Nain Singh, Kishan Singh Rawat, the explorers of Tibet. And in that, he started talking about the fact that people like him were actually inheritors of a tradition of walking the mountains. Naturally, I asked him, walking the mountains? He said, no, I don't mean walking the mountains as you and I are walking, but what I mean is walking the mountains, meaning walking the mountain peaks. And I said, that's interesting. And he said, well, and he started the story of Sunapati Shoka, one of a legendary Bhotia trader. And it was with this anecdote that I myself grew a curiosity to take this whole story to its end. So starting with this little introduction, let me talk about Sunapati Shoka. Sunapati Shoka was a man of extraordinary energy. When crossing the sharp precipices of mountains, he never descended to follow the routes made by the snaking bends of river valleys, but just walked right over them. His traveling companions could only be quaint fairies, sprites, and other celestial beings, those who could match the speed and agility with which he scaled heights. Cocking a snook, as it were, to Kingri Bingri, the two dogs that guarded the most treacherous mountain passes or la that were closest to his village, he would take his jubus or yaks, decorated with brightly colored ribbons, saddlebags laden with grains, sugar, spices, hardware, broadcloth, dry roasted barley, powder, or sampa or sattu to nourish him, and traveled onwards to the mandis of Hundesh, as Tibet was then known. He was usually the first of the Monpas to arrive, Monpas meaning the Bhotias, to arrive ahead of other traders, and he bartered his goods for salt from the Tibetan mines. The musk, borax, tails of yaks, herbs, and hides maybe even a fine lapis lazuli for his beautiful daughter Rajola that he purchased from the Hunyas or the Tibetans. And these he would take down to the valleys below to the Jhula Devi fair, which is on the banks of the swift flowing Kali River, back home towards Pithoragarh, and further south in the Tarai to the Tanakpur Mandi in the dusty sal forested regions where the Kali River widens to become the Saryu. He was a man whom the gods had gifted the feet of a unicorn. And could he not but be the richest trader amongst all the Bhotias or Shokas of the Johar Valley, as the early inhabitants were known? This is an epithet that has stuck and distinguished this tribal group from other Bhotia communities living in separate clusters in the Himalayas, in Nepal, Bhutan, the Garhwal, and Kumaon, inhabiting segments of the giant mountains. Sunapati Shoka was one such hero. He too is a keeper of the same tradition, but his descendant, Durga Singh Rawat, my mountain guide, is a keeper of the same tradition as his forebears, of formidable walkers of mountains, an ability that gave them the hardiness of heroes, extraordinary wealth, and imbued in them a wily mind to guide it. It gave them longevity. All this he tells me as we traverse the narrow littered street that makes up the shanty bazaar of Munshiari Tehsil, a tradition that people like him have reinvented to serve as guides to trekkers and climbing clubs, activities that allow his community to keep their tryst with mountains. Now, having said this, today the same place, Munshiari, which is the ahead of Pithoragarh, around 200 kilometers beyond, and the base of the Panchachuli range, is a very different sight. It's full of people and households who look vacantly, almost as if they are longing for a homeland that they have lost. Because these are people of a transhuman's way of life, moving from two or three settlements, two or three villages in which they would carry their goods and come down. But all this was lost. How? Why? Where did it end? So let's continue the story further. First, let's talk about this land. This land, which was known as Bhotantik in Sanskrit literature, was claimed to be peopled by people of a Rajput clan who had fled into the mountains. But when you read Atkinson, you realize that this might apply to the rulers, but it certainly would not apply to the populace over whom they ruled. The filial and other links that the population over whom they ruled will be discussed later. Let's just take the history of Bhotantik. When we see documents from the Chand Rajas of Kumaon around the 1580s, we find they have seized control of this region of the Johar Valley, the Dharma Valley, the Chauras and Vyas valleys, which are the four valleys that actually form our entry points into Tibet. The fifth valley, which is near Mana and Niti, is towards the Badrinath temple. The British thought the Bhotias were of Tibetan origin, and this land, Bhot, because it bordered both Nepal and Tibet, and because these Bhotias carried out a trade through these fragile passes in the Kumaon region. More than that, this is a region of the central Himalayas which connects very closely to Tibet, but were controlled entirely by these Bhotia tribes, and their walking capacity or ability, their hardiness and strength, gave them a kind of monopoly as well as a superiority, because like your pattern tanks today or other kinds of weaponry that you establish, it was the strength of these communities that only could get you across into Tibet. As I said earlier, these were these five valleys that control these mountain passes. And because people were not hardy enough to live there, or wily enough or intelligent enough to find a means to live there, it was the Bhotias who controlled them. The main aim aim of staying in these valleys was for them to actually move their goods and trade further down into the mandis of Tibet, be it Gyanima, Gartok, or Takla Kot, which was the most popular of the mandis. Takla Kot is a day's journey on horseback from Gunji, which is the last outpost through the Lipu Lake Pass when you go to Mansarovar. And from there, when you went to Takla Kot, all the traders would come with their goods. And these traders would settle in and trade only with their mitra or with their counterpart, that is their Tibetan friend. That's an interesting history because these people, at some point of time, exchanged what you call gamgyas. Gamgyas were like documents in which they were bound to each other. As Vinita Hoon writes in her book, Living on the Move, there was a mitra or a friend appointed on the Tibetan side of the border. And that mitra or friend was the only one you could sell to. They say that at some point of time, a large stone was broken into half. The Tibetan counterpart kept one half of the stone, and the Bhotia counterpart kept the other. When they moved into these mandis to trade, the appointee of the Tibetan trader or himself or his son or anybody else in his family carried that stone with them to the mandi. And when they would see when the mitra would show the other part of the stone and it was joined together, only then was the trade agreement honored. Interestingly, these agreements were like inheritances of land. They were passed down from generation to generation. But only a Tibetan Mitra could actually break the agreement, not his Bhotia counterpart. This trade continued. The trade, as I said, was for this rare commodity, Tibetan salt. Salt was something that was not easily available in this part of the North India, and it was a priceless commodity. The Bhotias were the only people who controlled this trade of salt. They would take all manner of goods across and bring back salt to India. This trade that was carried out became to be known as Namak ka Vyapar. However, later, during the time of the British, when salt was manufactured in a cheaper way, it turned to borax. Borax was necessary for smelting, and it was through the Bhotias that this borax was actually imported to Europe also. Eventually, that also changed, and when we were closer to independence, we find all manner of goods went across. Sometimes some traders tell us even things like imported cigarettes, 555, that were wanted in Lhasa by monks, and even a motorcycle. And they would carry these across, and the nature of trade changed. However, in 1947, when we became independent, trade, though it continued, as I mentioned, the goods had changed. But to give it to you in very brief, when the Chinese assumed control of Tibet in 1959 and the Sino-Indian War broke out in 1962, this barter came to an abrupt end. With the end of that, the Indo-Tibetan border was sealed. And with the end of that, these high villages, Milam being the highest at 11 or 12,000 feet, wore a deserted look, like Oliver Goldsmith's poem, A Deserted Village. Whole families then abandoned their homes and came down and did not go back. 33 years after that, with the Kailash route being opened up to pilgrimage, there was also a trading route that was revived. But it was mostly trade in wool. As we were just talking before the starting of this lecture, this wool is not just camel's wool, it is also the pasham wool that comes in through this route. And pasham shawls are now being, however, as the lady Tara had mentioned, the art of weaving pasham was really confined to the Kashmiris, and therefore This trade did not really pick up in the manner that it should have, because the art of weaving, thicker kind of material, is there among the Bhotias, but not the fine weaving that the Kashmiri has a monopoly of. So now let us go back to a little more description of these journeys. Mongoloid in appearance, the Bhotias of medium height with tanned ruddy skins, scanty beards, and slanting eyes. Imagine them in a colorful procession, clothed in distinct long frock coats, baku, woolen shoes, bukcha, and a long white turban, tanka, the tingling of bells hanging from their yaks or jubbus, making their annual journey over treacherous mountain passes. They must have been a picturesque caravan on the snowy ranges northeast of Mount Nanda Devi. Today, that is gone. But then, saddle bag with as much as 30 to 40 kilos on their backs and a whole 30 or 50 or even 100 sheep, they would brave wind and weather. Every able bodied person would go to Tibet or to the mandi closest to their village, Gyanama, Gartok, Taklakot, or any others that were above the Nari Khorsum upper basin of the Satluj River in western Tibet, be he a muleteer, a trader, or a pilgrim, or a slave. Entry into this particular valley that I documented, which is the Johar Valley, is through a ghati, or a cobbled dirt track called Karancha, that starts from the little town of Munshiari. It is called the Good Road to Milam, and Milam is the last populous village in the ghati. The first Padao, there are 13 villages along this route, and the first Padao, or the first village of Lilam, is 12 to 14 kilometers away along the Gori Ganga River, which cuts a deep gorge and is fed by the Milam Glacier about 56 kilometers away. Gori, like the Pandari and Kali and other rivers, are form steep rock faces, and they on either side of them are flanked these very picturesque villages, but these were inhabited for just a few months from June to October. The caravan went up as early as perhaps May, but when snowfall came towards the end of September, beginning October, they would come down. These caravans that were of sheep caravans were heralded by ferociously loyal Bhotia dogs. And through twists and turns of the mountains, there would usually be heard a cry of rail gadi. Rail gadi is coming. A rail gadi meant when something triggered off a race by the sheep, and you could see 100 sheep literally running down those narrow paths and led by the Bhotia dog. We do know that when the Buddhist missionaries and even later the English travelers like Moorcraft Thompson arrived, this trade was already in existence. But from these traders, the British, when they came, they built good roads and improved upon the roads that the Gorkhas made. It's interesting that the Gorkha roads here, I mean, they're not roads, they're tracks really, Karanchas, were known as the all-weather roads, which means even in the height of winter and the harshest of snowfall, they could be traversed. What was the reason for that? The reason was that the Bhotia traders were not just ordinary men. They came amongst the so-called Bill Gates and the Donald Trumps and the silicon entrepreneurs of today. They were the highest taxpayers, not only to the Chand rulers before, the Kumauni rulers, but to the British who came later and the Gorkhas before them. All of them realized the wealth that they brought to the coffers. And so there was an emphasis on keeping their roads and routes clear and clean. So these Bhotias had the benefit of patronage from the British even in the colonial period. But there was another reason. The great game was being played, and everybody in all the important Anglo-Saxon powers were interested in containing the expansionist ideas of Russia. For that, Tibet and China were needed. And therefore, the British trained explorers from this community to map Tibet. Patrick French, in his biography of the explorer Francis Young Husband, says the British began training Indians in surveying work. The Pandits were trained to use theodolites, the altitude thermometers, and sent off years at a time to unmapped regions, disguised as pilgrims or traders. The difference between intelligence work and private espionage was never clearly defined. There are several accounts of Nain Singh's journey of 1,200 miles from Kathmandu to Lhasa and onward to Mansarovar Lake and back to India in 1865-66. The one excerpted from the Indian explorers of the 19th century states, he brought back details for a map of the southern trade route of Tibet and the Sangpo's course for 600 miles. This pioneering feat won him accolades from European geographers and was recognized by the Royal Geographical Society. Like modern-day mountain guide Durga Singh Rawat, who accompanies me, Nain Singh was born in 1830 in the highest domicile village of Milam in Johar Valley. Pandit Kishan Singh, also a Milamwal, was more famous and was the last survivor of the old Indian explorers. He was called to Dehradun by Colonel Walker in 1867 and given practical training under Captain Montgomery and Pandit Nain Singh. The Great Trigonometric Survey was setting about training Indians for exploring the uplands of Tibet, Mongolia, and Central Asia. His first most important journey was performed in 1872 when he made a route survey from Shigatse, north of Sangpo, round the shores of Tengri, Nor, and reached Lhasa from the north. His last journey in Tibet and Mongolia during 1878 and 1882, full of long persevering adventure, set the seal on his labor and won him applause from the geographers in Europe. But who were Nain Singh and Kishan Singh? They were none other than latter-day Sunapati Shokas, or ancestors of my Durga Singh Rawat, my mountain guide. The craggy terrain and the harsh climate of the region has conditioned them to an amazing strength and endurance to brave the rigors of these perilous trading routes. And the tradition bred in them an intrepidity which was matchless. But it also bred in them a kind of contempt for valley dwellers, a contempt for the Khasyas and Rajputs who simply till the land. Recounts Rawat, in the latter 19th century, the two largest settlements British Kumaon knew were Almora, a little over 5,000 feet, and Milam, high above the tree line in the trans-Himalayan zone at approximately 11,000 feet. In the short summer months here, they would grow barley, buckwheat, papar, mustard, and vegetables. But today, Milam is a relic. The residences have been shorn of their once beautiful carved doorways, of which I'll tell you a little more when I start showing you the slides. They've been pulled down and burnt. A full 500 households we had, says Rawat, lamenting the loss of Milam and a homeland. A settlement was so large that children would get lost in the alleys, and mothers would have to climb to the high point above the village to spot them. He now ruminates in very sad wonderment. Where have they gone? So when we look at this and we look at this trade that I have been talking about, these are the kind of things that come to mind and which we remember. I have given you a short synopsis, and I thought as we go on, I would like to maybe make further comments as I show you some slides. But I will just add a little bit more, so please bear with me. I wanted to just say something about Vinita Hoon's book, Living on the Move, which is a fabulous document about this bygone trade and about the Johari, not the Johari Bhotias, the Bhotias by and large. She mentions there were 16 passes into Tibet and all of them alive, all of them being used. It was like a highway, a traffic jam would happen now and then because those karanchas, which were perhaps somewhere 6 feet or 9 feet or 10 feet, in fact, a good road was considered what is called a no bakri road. That is, 9 sheep could be side by side, and that was considered a good road. So this was the kind of traffic jam in the summer season along those routes, which are now totally abandoned. As I mentioned, when the trade closed down, when borders between India and China were sealed due to their occupation of Tibet, this brotherhood, this mitra relationship, this sense of interdependency, this exchange of goods that they needed, wheat and other staple crops, and that we needed salt, gold, lapis lazuli, and other items for the plains, this simply disappeared. So the trade was not just money exchanged on either side. It was also a symbol of interdependency and understanding how one lived in the mountains and how one became brethren or lived in coexistence. And that is what is extremely interesting when you look into these trades. There are 16 passes into Tibet. The Johar Bhotias use the Untadhura pass to cross over to Tibet, while the Dharma Bhotias use the Dharma pass, and they reached Gyanima Mandi. The Vyas Bhotias used the Lankle Lake Pass and also the Lipu Lake Pass to cross over into Tibet. So just like today, we have highways going here and there, and we can have the option of various routes. They also had the option of these different routes. Um, I have given you this introduction. One more thing I would like to say about the Bhotias is, depending on how you view them, the local plains people would view them as being very wily. A local Pahari saying was, they measured salt in a small nali, that is a measure, but they took away grain in a big nali. Each village has spun its own half truths about their manipulative acumen. But the important thing is acumen they had. Each in one tale, a whole village was purchased from a Pahari for the price of one wool blanket. The scarcity of salt in the interior of Kumaon made this barter highly profitable to the Bhotia, who gained these reputations. The tragedy is that when we became independent, the Bhotia, whose population is restricted, opted for the scheduled tribe status. But that did not give him significant avenues of employment in the Kumaon services or other such routes. Interestingly, what the local Bhotia traders now say what was worse is, from a community of entrepreneurs with great skill and endurance, we are reduced to scheduled tribes, which makes us people who are dependent on the government giving us handouts for something. And this lack of status and this blow to their independence and pride is perhaps the greatest victim of the closure of this trade. Because deprived of these mountain passes, the opening of the mountain passes, they stuck in the mountains almost like caged animals. They didn't know where to turn or what to do. Today, we are noticing a change. The border roads are now moving into those areas. I am told even in Milam, 17 kilometers have been built south, and from Munchiari upwards, Rilam, another 14 kilometers is built. And maybe in time, there will be a proper highway, and these villages will now come back to life, and people go back and reclaim their ancestral homes. When that happens, a different kind of entrepreneurship will develop. But as of today, as I said, it is a sad testimony to new political borders, new political techniques of maintaining peace on our borders, where the objective of looking at them is through the eyes of people who are in the plains and who have little understanding of mountain cultures, of mountain affinities, and the sense that that religion and other forms of ancestral of worship and lineal ties created. And I feel that is the worst victim. So having said that, I've taken quite a bit of your time. And having said that, let's look at a few slides. And if you'll bear with me, I'll just learn how to share my screen. Is that okay, Sonali? Hello, just a minute here. Um,
Yes.
yes. Yeah,
Yeah. Perfect.
yeah. Yeah, so this is the title of the documentary, They Who Walked Mountains. And having given you my little introduction, you would fully understand why I named it They Who Walked Mountains. Because for me, that was a kind of emblem that described this culture. Uh, I'll just take you to the next slide. Just a minute. Um, how do I do that? Do I just enter, or could you just?
Uh, I think we can see the PowerPoint. You just have to. There are two arrows, so you can click on one of the arrow to move forward. Or
Yeah,
on,
yeah,
yeah.
here. Yeah. So this gives you a short description, which I have just explained to you. Um, the border communities are the Shokas, Rungs, and Tolchas and Marchas. Uh, and it also tells you a little bit about the film. I'll give you the next. This is a picture of, I think, Nanda Devi, and you can see the rhododendrons blooming. The photographer is Anup Sa, a very fine photographer of Kumaon, who has very kindly lent me these uh, pictures. I was just telling you about the terraced farming in the lower valleys. So the topography looks a bit like this. These are the forests. When you're in the lower valleys, they're the Tun, the Banj, the pine, the Devdar, the cypress, um, lush. Kumaon has one of the richest forests of India, forest region. But these are all in 3,000 to 8,000 feet high. When we come to Bhotia country, we leave these forests behind. Again, these are just some snapshots of the lower valleys that we move through. When the Bhotias uh, would come up from Almora, possibly in those days, even by motor vehicles, they would reach the intermediary spot of Munchiari, the depots. And these depots is where they would rest, keep all the goods they had collected from the plains, start the home and hearth in their kitchens for a few weeks, get themselves prepared before they started the ascent. They would also till the land and see that the crop would be ready so that when they descended, they would have something to eat. A lot of these lands were purchased by the Bhotias through their trade. It made them, as I mentioned, the envy of a lot of communities. Interestingly, most of the Bhotia homes, like with other Kumaoni homes, are embellished by very intricate wood carving. And these carvings have an iconography, which is, again, interestingly, pan Indian in its nature. Um, of course, it has a lot of floral motifs and motifs taken from their travels or from the geography around. Interestingly, also, the carvers of these doorways did not actually enjoy any high status, though they were called in to embellish these homes, as with the rest of India. These are windows of the lower valleys, and they're known as tibari, or three paneled windows, but they bear very Hindu iconography. When we go higher into the Bhotia regions, they carry some of these with them, but they also have very interesting other iconography, which is reflected in the slides that I'll be showing later. This is a typical agricultural scene. Men always plowed the land, but women did all the rest of the work. This is again from the lower valleys. Food, as you know, is important, and therefore in these regions given great priority and in their homes, so that it's even hung outside like this, because this is garlic and onion, and it can be used uh, over the winter months. So it's not stored separately in a kitchen, but it shows off your wealth. It also shows off your own ability to survive the winter when you have all this. These are again the lower valleys. These are Kumaoni women. These are not Bhotia women. I'm showing you these slides so that you can see the difference when I show you the other slides. You notice their facial features. You notice the agriculture that is evident, the lush forests, grain is being sifted. Again, as we go higher, these are women. The caste distinctions are evident in their facial features. I'll come to this a little bit later. I'm just showing you the doorways which are carved. And depending upon how elaborate the doorway is, that determines the status of the wealth of that household. Now, these villages, you can see there are homes which are at a higher altitude, and then you have homes which are at a lower altitude and even lower, because the caste distinction here is evident. The higher castes had homes in the higher regions, but the serving classes or castes, traditionally known as the domes, but who now fall into the scheduled tribe category, were always denied the better sun, the better water source, and the higher altitude. They were relegated to the lower altitude, where sometimes there was no sun, or the soil would be very sandy, or there would be a meager terrace for them to survive. Terrace farming, I mean. Now, this is the map of Uttarakhand. The region where we have been talking about is only here. Here. This is Nepal. The river, that is the Kali River, comes down here. And when it comes down here, when it reaches here, it becomes the Saryu. So, and the Gori goes a little bit like this. And it's along these two rivers and along this that the 5 mountain passes that take you into Tibet exist. This is again just a view of the geographical terrain of the Kumaon Himalayas. These are hill women, a generation from a child to the grandmother. Again, you can see the carved doorways. You can see that this doorway is particularly interesting because it has got all floral and other motifs. And some of the iconography is even Islamic, which is it's a kind of a geometrical design rather than anything else, which speaks of a very interesting travel and a kind of a what is called a Guru Shishya Parampara that existed, because obviously the castes that fell into the category of wood carvers, that is the Shilpkars, were not very well traveled to the plains, but they had somehow inherited this Guru Shishya Parampara, which is which is what they used when they were designing these chaukhats for homes. Sometimes you would even find an elephant or a lion in the upper homes in Milam. I saw a lion, a British lion, or a fleur de lis, which spells the fact that the Bhotias traveled widely and perhaps brought back these icons to the craftsman, and he copied them. This is one of the villages at the base of the mountain, one of the Bhotia villages. This would be the depots where they stored all the goods that they brought before crossing over. This is where they rested in May. As you can see, the mustard has been planted, and this is where they would come back. This is a village along the way to the Lipu Lake Pass. Um, I think this is a village, Garbiang. Parts of it have sunk, and I'll show you some of the homes that later, in the later slides. Again, villages that were at the base of the mountain. This is home number, the highest. This is an interesting village. It is called Laspa. And again, here you can see the khandars, or the homes are in ruins. It's a very hard trek to get to Laspa. It's about 2 kilometers on a sort of almost uphill route. The important thing in that is that why did they have a village that was so difficult to access? Because even here there would be Khampa raiders who came down from Tibet, because the Bhotias were well known to store a lot of gold and silver, and they had precious jewelry with them. So there would be mountain raids into these villages. So homes and villages that were difficult to access gave enough warning to them that there was a siege at hand. And therefore, this village, Laspa, is quite remote and quite cut off. Now here we come to Milam. This is the village. As you can see, it's in ruins. And the fact that there were 500 homes here is difficult to believe when you see it today. It is a very important village also because it had the first English medium school. Way back in the 1820s or 30s, there was a missionary, a Bhotia family. In fact, I met the great-granddaughter, another lady, Miss Rawat, trekking along with me. And I asked her, I said, what are you doing here? She lives and teaches somewhere in, I think, Ohio or Kentucky. And she makes that annual pilgrimage, much in the nature of her ancestors, to her ancestral home. She said, we Bhotias always visit the home of our ancestors once a year. And if you did not do this in the earlier days, it was considered, you were ostracized for disrespecting your ancestors. So she comes and she would come and trek these 60 kilometers to her ancestral home, pay respects to her ancestors, offering puja and other sort of spiritual offerings, and then trek back, so that that home was not abandoned fully, that some human being or some clansman had laid claim and kind of told that house or home that we will be back when the time comes. We haven't forsaken you. I found that a very interesting and a romantic story. This is again one of the homes in Milam, or I think it is Dharma Valley. Sorry, this is not Milam, this is Dharma, the neighboring valley. But you can see the intricate carvings on their doors and windows, which tells you that this was the home of a wealthy trader, because he could indulge in these embellishments. And this is what announced to the world that he was an important man. Another village close by, I think this is Martoli or Martoli, from where most of these villages, The people belonging there carry their names, like Martoli village, they would be called the Martolias. Milam village, they would be called Milamvals. Burfu village, they would be called the Burfials. So they carried their surnames coming from the village. This is a Bhotia herder with his little child, and you can see the straw, the for the winter, which he's going to use as fodder and fuel. Again, this is a beautiful photograph by Anup Sa, uh, one of the finest photographers of that region. Now here you can see the steps in the doorway. These steps are a kind of a Tibetan design, and this is what they brought back and drew on little pieces of paper, and then asked the craftsmen to imitate it and to transfer it onto their homes. This is a closer look at the Garbiang village, which has since then sunk. Garbiang used to be perhaps the last village before you reach the Lipu Lake Pass, or Gunji. Gunji was the last village. This was one of the biggest, most populous villages after Milam, but in a neighboring valley called the Chaudas Valley, the Chaudas Vyas valleys, which is the traditional route to the Kailash Mansarovar. This is uh, one of the houses of the wealthy traders. Some of them have incorporated that and rebuilt this, but this would be found in the lower valleys, not in the higher ones, because transporting cement and stone right up would be very difficult. I have seen, and I did see then, donkeys and mules and yaks carrying bricks, but not stone. This is again a very interesting motif. Of course, this is not the subject of my lecture today, but this is something that I studied when studying the wood carving of this region, and I found these motifs a little more European, and perhaps copied from different European objects that the Bhotias found in the plains, because some of the Bhotia traders went as far as Banaras and to Mumbai, carrying precious goods with them. For example, the corals, the lapis, and other such items, and especially gold. Tibetan gold was prized. So they would take these items and trade them as far as Mumbai, which gave them an opportunity to look at the markets and fairs of colonial India in those days, and perhaps come back with ideas for embellishing their own homes. The bugyals, or the alpine meadows, were very much part of their trekking route. Rare herbs and mushrooms grow in these bugyals. Not only would the herders stay there for a while, pitching their tents, they would also collect very precious herbs, which they would take to Taklakot Mandi or Gyanima. And these famous mandis or hearts or markets is where uh, a lot of Chinese medicinal herbs are procured, and even as far as Japan. Of course, the Bhotias recognized these various herbs, and some of them in those days, which is, I'm talking about the 1960s or something, would be sold at something like 600 or 800 rupees for a kilo, which is an astronomical price at that time. So the recognition of these things were very much in their ken, in their understanding. But again, it was knowledge that they kept to themselves. There would be specific traders for such agricultural produce, and there would be specific markets for this. They were very knowledgeable about it, and it is through such acumen that they were able to not exist in these high mountain passes, but actually live a life of a reasonable comfort and wealth. The Brahma Kamal is this rare flower called the Shiva flower, found normally 12 to 14,000 feet high. And it is the offering at the Kailash temple also in but not Badrinath, but Kedarnath temple. And it is sometimes taken into, versions of it is sort of put into the iconography of what has adorned their homes. So I placed these two slides side by side just for you to see how they took from nature um, the beauty, the form, and transported it to the craft of wood carving, which was, as I said, a status symbol. This is a very intricate one and very complex design and very different. So I had to show you this slide because it again shows the sophistication of the Bhotia trader, his understanding and his travel that gave him this broad outlook even in the arts and crafts. These designs did not come out of the craftsman's head. These designs were taught to him by the traders who asked him to interpret it into theirs. Obviously, these were points of interest the way today when you wear an item of jewelry or you have a shawl, which is something different or special or unique. In the same way, it proclaimed your sophistication, your status, and the fact that you perhaps had seen wealth for a few generations. These are the dwarf rhododendrons because as you grow higher, the tree line changes and you have various local trees, amongst them the dwarf rhododendrons, um, the Himalayan blue poppy, which is also around, I think, 12 to 14,000 feet. I'm not very sure. Again, a picture of the dwarf rhododendrons in bloom. You can see the tree line is thinning. This is, I think, the Ghoral or the Bhoral, the antelope. I'm sorry, I can't tell you exactly, but it is, uh, I think, the Ghoral. That is a kind of a short Tibetan deer, but I don't think it's the Pasham goat. These are the kind of views that they would encounter. This is the Panchachuli range, the range that can be seen when you go up the Johar Ghati or the Johar Valley. This is the Nanda Devi range, which you can see from Martoli village, which is perhaps one of the most beautiful villages because it's at the base of the Nanda Devi. And it's interesting that the most frequent visitors to this particular base, which is again extremely difficult to reach, at least it was then, are the Japanese tourists who have begun to come in high numbers into this region. Here we are. This is a village settlement. Again, right just at the border of Tibet. If you go across this mountain, you'll be into Tibet. So they are overlooking that region. And when you just go across the steppes or plains of Tibet, this is, of course, Tibet, Chorten. This picture is from Deb Mukherjee, Ambassador Deb Mukherjee, again, a very fine photographer, and to whom I'm grateful for lending me this photograph. Um, Mentioning here just a little bit about the Bhotia religious beliefs. It's a mix of animism, a mix of Buddhism, some Hindu beliefs, but mostly a veneration of Kul Devtas or their family gods. And in the family gods would come heroes and heroines and mythological tales of that particular part of the world. But interestingly, also, when they would pass one of these higher mountain passes, and I'm not talking about the five main passes of Untadhura, Kingri Bingri, etc. I'm talking about just when you crossed one mountain or hill and then came to the other, they had the practice called Katpatiya. The Katpatiya is a mound that you place. Each traveler coming before you, coming after you, would also put a piece of stone on that. So you come across these mounds of stone one after another, they've been sort of placed over the generations and years and centuries, which mark which mark that one person has been there and passed. This is what I was told. In Atkinson's Government Gazetteer, E.T. Atkinson in 1886 says, heaps of stones and wood called katpatya are frequently seen on hills or at crossroads. These are due to the offering of the travelers proceeding on a journey, almost as if to say, thank you, Lord, for allowing me to reach here in, one piece. The custom is said to have been established by the lawgiver Yagnavalka, and when adding a heap of stone, an invocation to the god is made. So it has some Sanskrit and Brahminical, um, uh, references also, which again shows you the complex nature of worship, right from animistic, local gods to a link with ancient Brahminical rites as well as Buddhist rites. Buddhism, of course, was very prevalent in this part of the world, but it was interpreted in their own way and not necessarily in the Tibetan Buddhism as we know it, or the Tibetan or the Buddhism of the Lamas as we know it. Let me go to the next one. This is a very fine mansion, so to speak, as you can see in disrepair. There's a sketch which shows it, what it could have been and would have been like. And again, at 12,000 or 13,000 feet, I think this is taken from the Garbyang village, the village where a lot of this has sunk. It's a double, as you can see, it's a double leaf door, which is rare. It's a two door. Uh, Maybe it was a chieftain or somebody who was very important or very wealthy trader. It's interesting because number one, this kind of wood, which is the tuni wood, it's like a mahogany, which is now completely extinct from Kumau. It is not found in these parts, but a local cedar may have been used. But tuni is a wood that came from around 7 or 8,000 feet and was brought up to these. It's a very hard wood and very long lasting. And when the English started planting the pine, and it was such an insidious tree that it sort of took over everywhere because it was the first form of industrial forests. And as you perhaps all know, that these forests were planted to feed the British railway industry and other commercial wooden requirements. So this tree, the Himalayan mahogany, disappeared. And it's one of the sad losses of the environment of the Himalayas changing. Interestingly, as I said, when we look at it today, when we have these narrow karanchas or paths, I'm sorry, please look at the documentary to see how narrow those paths were. And then when you come across little mansions like this, you really have a deep and sincere respect for the Bhotia traders, their acumen and their entrepreneurship to create such wealth in such difficult climes. This is not your Switzerland, this is not your Europe, this is the Himalayas, where access was something very difficult to surmount. Again, you can see the sophistication of these carvings. The reason I'm showing you these slides is to show you the artistry and sophistication that existed, and hence to endorse the fact that the traders were a very rich community. Again, a tibari, very different to the one I showed you, which was in red. Again, you see a lot of floral motifs here. And then you see again motifs in a geometric design, which is reminiscent of, the Mughal monuments of the Taj Mahal or of the earlier slave dynasty or others, where you see the Islamic iconography come in. These were copied and used and utilized. And that again shows the cosmopolitan kind uh, uh, you know, idiom that these people used. This is a typical Bhotia woman, a Johari woman. This is a woman from Johar Valley in her traditional finery, her silver jewelry. You can see her lapis and her corals around her neck. Some of these were like, an inch thick. Again, this is a bride wearing her tribal finery. Interestingly, in this part, the whole marriage customs were very different. If I can just, mention that um, remember, a lot of these customs come before Shankaracharya came to the Kumau and brought with him his Sanatan Dharma and the establishment of all the Hindu shrines. So here, the customs of the Bhotias, if I can just tell you, um, it's different to the other Kumaoni population. A particular point of difference are the marriage customs. Among the Dharmai, Vyas, and Chauras tribes, the custom is to meet in a meeting house called a Samba Kuri. And here they consume liquor or chakti, a homemade wine, and dance in an effort to come to know each other. This is a very well known custom called the Rangbang, a kind of bachelor's dormitory under whose aegis such activities were carried on. But it is now waning because of the influence of the more sort of and the desire of the Bhotias to be taken as Hindus. They have now given up a lot of their old customs. Uh, these marriages were settled by the boy by kidnapping the bride, which would then be followed by a formal ceremony. This was always in conformity with the girl's wishes. They would take this chakti or this rice wine and a papa roti, that is a roti made from this indigenous grain, from their home. And if the gift was accepted by the girl's parents, then they were engaged. There was also this custom known as the price of milk. That is, after marriage, the boy's family have to pay a small sum of money to the girl. So, the opposite of dowry, the boy's family paid the money. If it was not paid, it was considered inauspicious. A goat is sacrificed at the temple, and the village people then make a meal of it. Only the girl has the right to the money. The larger part she gives to her brothers and the rest of the relatives, who put it into buying some cloth or giving her a gift. Interestingly, from this, people infer that perhaps the Bhotia woman was considered, like the rest of India, the women were relegated to an inferior position. That is not true. The Bhotia women exercise a lot of right and decision making, though the traders who went across the mountain passes were men. They left the women and children behind in the villages like Milam, who then kept the family going, kept it fed, supported, warm, and healthy, sent it to school, sent their children to school, the English medium school I mentioned to you, which is also was run by a Rawat family who was the first padri of that region, because Christianity had come into this part of the world during the 1830s. And interestingly, the Bhotia traders knew English long before the rest of the Kumaoni population were educated in English. This is again a posed photograph of Kumaoni women and, sorry, Bhotia women and the man in traditional dress. This is a picture of a craftsman whom I had a very long conversations with, who said this interestingly again, that though these were the people who sort of crafted all these homes and did all that, they were never relegated any respect, and they were not given the kind of they were like, there was slavery existed. So they was a lot of them went from generation to generation as slaves of the Bhotias. And this is a kind of black mark onto the caste structure there. They were known as kunkiyas, or traditional hereditary bonded labor to the Bhotia overlord. And like the other caste system in India, relegated to villages and homes, I mean, homes in the village that were poorer, shabbier, and less advantageous than where the overlord had. So their position remained very sorrowful and sad, though this is another picture of another craftsman who was bonded to a Bhotia trader, and with independence became, separated himself, and then built himself a home, which I would like to show you. Then built himself a home in Munshiari, where he peopled it with his family, uh, in a kind of a thumbing his nose, or his, to his boss, earlier boss, saying, look, if you could build those homes, so can I. So this is his version of what he thought a prosperous modern home, which also signaled his freedom from the slavery from the Bhotia trader. These pictures, of course, show you the doorways and this. This is a Johari Bhotia who consider themselves offspring or offshoots of Rajput Chauhans from the valley who fled into the mountains due to some persecution. So they keep with them some traditional dress which resembles some of the more traditional costumes of the plains. This is their dance, the cholia. And these are women performing the same dance. Interestingly, they say, there was a saying that Tibetan woman is like gold, the Bhotia woman is like silver, but the Kumaoni woman is like a poor grade of wheat. Now, the Kumaoni woman is very, very hardworking and extraordinary. So when they say that she's just a poor grade of wheat, you can imagine how much more hardworking or capable the Bhotia woman was. This is again the Kumaoni Cholia dance, which is again in these high mountains. These are their colorful costumes. You can see the bagpipes. It's interesting that they have bagpipes, again, a colonial legacy. This is all the village gathered because there has been a death, and they are there. Uh, Again, chakti, or the rice wine, is kept in barrels, and it is drunk on such occasions. And the whole village mourns the passing away of one of their. You can see the silver jewelry particularly, but prized possession is the corals. These are corals that are brought again from the Tibetan mandis, brought from Tibet. I've shown you this picture in contrast. This is the lower valleys. These are Kumaoni women, not Bhotia women. And you can see the difference in the costume, in their getup, even the shoes, as you can see, are those woven shoes, whereas these are wearing anklets. And again, this I've shown you to show you a contrast between the lower valleys. This is from the lower valleys, their kind of costume, their kind of wooden carving and architecture. These are Bhotia women. And we are coming to the end of it now. This is their weaving. Today, duns and other woolen products are woven, but the most important item which has vanished from their talent and their skill was what was called the thulma, which was kind of a rough sheep's, not a rough, a fine sheep's wool, like a pasham wool, woven on one side and left raw and rough on the other side. Those are now collector's items, and perhaps you may not find them anymore. The art of weaving them has gone. And now, as a finale, just pictures of the Nanda Devi. This is Nanda Devi in the evening. Perhaps the most important festivals here are the Navratri festivals, both in April and in October, because they mark the ascent into the valleys in April, the upper valleys, and the descent in October. At the end of the Navratras, they would come down. And with this, I end my presentation. I do hope it hasn't been too, well, I hope you found some of it interesting.
Ma'am, not some of it, all of it actually. You took us to these high altitude places, and things that we had no clue of. You just opened that wonderful scene in front of us, and the kind of work that you have done, and the keen observation and all that knowledge. We've gained so much from you today, and I'm sure everybody echoes what I have felt. And this was just amazing. Thank you so much for this wonderful talk, and what a journey it is. It's a journey of those who walk the mountains, and you who followed those who walked the mountains. It's a journey about you as
Yes.
well. So, at this point, I would ask those of you who want to ask questions, you please raise your hands. And we have our first question. Medhavi Gulati, you can take over the mic and ask your first question.
Thank you. Um, as I understand, ma'am, like Bhotias migrated from Kham in Tibet to settle in parts of Nepal and India. I have two questions. One is that their origin, which is rather obscure as to how they migrated from Tibet. Uh, what were the reasons that led to their migration? Uh, I have That's one question, and the second one is, if we travel to the northeast part of Nepal, which has a dense population of Sherpa and Bhotia. So many of the Sherpa, they identify themselves as Bhotia and vice versa. So I met some Sherpas whose ethnic group was Bhotia earlier, but now they've changed it to Sherpa. But their caste, their last name is still the same. For example, Pinasa or Salaka. But their middle name, which is their ethnic group, that keeps on uh, changing. Sometimes, like some of them add Sherpa, some of them have Bhotia, and they say that they are the same. They had same ancestors who traveled from Tibet. So, is there any difference between these two ethnic groups, Sherpa and Bhotia? And thank you for answering.
Well, my interest was really the trade. I have not really studied the ethnicity of the Bhotias per se. Of course, there's Majumdar and Shering and those other authors that you can read about this. I think D.N. Majumdar has said a lot about all this. But broadly speaking, I think this is very different in each valley. I don't think you can make these generalisms. For example, the Johari Bhotias do not like and will not marry the Bhotias from Niti, the Nitiwals. And it is because of their the bloodline. The bloodlines are different. So the Johar Bhotias do not consider themselves Tibetan at all. As I mentioned, the Bhotantic is a Sanskrit term. It has come from the Sanskrit term, not from Tibet, that land of Bhot. And today, often Bhotias consider it a disparaging term because of the way in which people immediately jump to the fact that they are descendants of the Tibetans. This is highly challenged, that they are descendants of the Tibetans. They are an ethnicity of that particular region, not necessarily Tibetan. Yes, they share the same mongoloid features, etc., which is, naturally part of the fact that you inhabit the same geographical space. But remember, Tibet is a plateau, and a plateau which is an alpine desert. Whereas the Bhotia regions, these are not at all. The geography is very different. The horticulture, the flora fauna is very different. Looking at Chauras, Vyas, yes, they consider them less so-called, high caste in those valleys, and even in Niti Mana. Obviously, there must have been a certain intermingling. Sometime a Bhotia trader could have brought himself a Tibetan wife and so on and so forth, or had a Tibetan wife on the other side and produced some children and brought her across. But I do not think that you can call them all descendants of the Kham or the other community that you mentioned. Sherpas, yes, are considered Nepali, or from the area of Nepal and are considered slightly different racially from these. But the fact that through history they do not intermarry into each other's valleys means that there is a certain ethnicity which is different and cannot be generalized like this. But as I said, I have not really studied ethnicity beyond the secondary sources that I've read. So I do not think I would be competent to make a conclusive answer to what you've said.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thanks, Madhavi. The next question is Dr. Nandini Bhattacharya's. And after that, I will take Dr. Aniket Alam's question. He's posted it on the chat window. So, Dr. Nandini, you can take over.
Thank you, Sonali. And thank you, Professor Kak. It is a fascinating talk. Um, Actually, I was wondering why the impact of Buddhism was not so much pronounced among the people you were talking about, like in architecture. And is it true, I mean, that the impact of Buddhism was less in their cultural and religious practices? And why? Is it influenced by the religious faith um, in the mainland where they had been visiting very frequently? Because I had been working in Sikkim and Kalimpong. And as you know, that Kalimpong, I mean, there had been the streams of Tibetan visitors, and they also brought salt and wool and everything. And in Kalimpong, there were warehouse, but they were not only devout Buddhist, they brought religion. Forget about Sikkim in Kalimpong. And Kalimpong, there were some families, Nepalese families, they were manufacturing, I mean, the craftsmen, they were producing the religious ritualistic utensils for the Tibetan visitors, and they were very much Tibet devout Buddhist. So why this difference?
I don't think I said that there was no influence of Buddhism. I said a lot of their beliefs were Buddhist, but animistic also. And there are also Hindu beliefs in that, because remember, this is the part of Shankaracharya. All his, from the 8th century onwards, Sanatan Dharma was being spread in these high mountain valleys. The Badri, Kedar, all these temples are there, Dwara Hat. So the Hindu beliefs are there, but in Johar Valley in particular. But Buddhism is very much part of part of their religious, panorama of their religious beliefs. I said closer home they have a lot of animistic and kul devtas, their family deities, etc., etc. So the little gods and the big gods. So there's the overshadowing larger umbrella of Buddhism and Hinduism, and within underneath that they have their ghosts and goblins and their parades and paris and jo bhi, traditional rural and tribal, I mean, communities had in the Kumaon Hills in the Himalayas. That is what I said. Beyond
So
that,
it is a mixed religious faith.
yes, it's very much mixed. Even the language is mixed. Language has some Sanskrit words, it has Tibetan words. It's a spoken language, not a written language. But it is
Right.
an amalgam and the whole idea of trade routes is the bottom line of this is amalgam. So
Yes,
I
I
don't
mean,
think there's any
I would
pure,
call it a
you can't be
confluence.
purist in any way. You can't be
Yeah,
purist in any way. Huh?
yeah, sure.
Um,
Interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, I think Ankit has put his questions on the
Yeah,
chat. The
yeah.
archival
I was
records.
I will read it out so that others can see. The question is, what are the archival records on the salt trade of the Bhotias? And where was the salt mined? Where was it sold? Is there any idea of the amount or values that were involved in this salt trade?
Aniket, Aniket, you will find all this if you look at my documentary. And I've even in the documentary documentary actually filmed the archival records. Um, some of them are to be found in the National Archives here, where you have very detailed, of goods and how much and value, etc., etc., all there. And even there is a list of my referred documents of secondary sources and primary sources given in the documentary. So if you just look at the documentary, you will find a list of all that. In case you want to do some research, that would be a very good source of information for you.
And like I said earlier, I will post the link to ma'am's documentary on our group and page. And those of you who are not on social media and you want it, you can just email it and I will send it off to you. We have our next question. Before I take the next question, Anubha Kakru wanted to ask that the pictures, are they mostly by Anup Sah, most of the pictures?
No, 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 not all of them. Some of the stunning ones are,
Mhm.
but there are two or three. I have mentioned one was Ambassador Deb Mukherjee. Then there's a very interesting young. I mean, that time he was young. Now he is very much alpine and working on glaciers and writing his book and has done his PhD on glaciers. His name is Vaibhav Kaul. I think he's, well, almost half a professor himself by now. So some are by him, and Anup, yes, and Deb Mukherjee primarily. Some are by me, probably the not so fancy ones.
And you shouldn't be self-critical because I think all of the photos were just beautiful. The way they have captured, their whole culture and identity. It's interesting. In the workshop today, we were talking about identity and so many things that we were talking. You kind of covered them, and it kind of connected whatever we were talking about. So we're very grateful for that. Before I take Aman Panta's question, we have Aditya Kutyal who messaged me in private. He says, the modernization has changed the way the product, the logistical approach the Bias Valley people take to trade with the Tibetans in Taklakot. And with roads being recently built in the valley, how do you see this trade route taking shape with time in the next decade?
Well, there is a trade with the Taklakot through the Bias Valley. It's about 200 kilometers, but it is confined to wool. And the wool that is coming in from Tibet is not something that is so rare or of such great interest or quality for it to become a thriving route. There is an interesting lady called Mukti Datta. I think perhaps she was in the same school as me also at some time, and she has started a very fine NGO called the Panchachuli Women's Cooperative, where she's weaving shawls from this wool that is being brought across from Taklakot. And it is with traders. And she was very kind to me 20 years ago, whenever it was, to say that, I can take you on this route. But as I said, it's not a thriving trade route. It has been opened for traders. It was a concession given to them. But the raison d'etre, so to speak, the reason why it should exist at that time was salt, or was borax, or it was Tibetan gold. That value is not there. The volume of trade or value of trade is not there, as far as I know.
And ma'am, the wool that was traded, because earlier we had this question, one of the students was asking about the dyes that were used. Were they natural, or do you see with the coming of the colonial powers, you had some kind of artificial colors being used by the people? Do you have any information on that?
No, wool that was brought in was raw wool. It was woven in the nucleated villages around Munshiari, as far as Johar is concerned. And in these nucleated villages, especially a village called Darkot, again, where there's an interesting initiative by the Pradhan there, who is a woman from Willems. She studied in Willems and is now settled there. And they do this, they make shawls, pashmina shawls, etc., etc. But the fineness, as I said, we were talking, Tara and I, the secret of weaving pashmina and making the fiber or the strand so fine that it creates this very thin pashmina fabric has not been mastered by the Bhotia weavers. So it is a thicker shawl, warm nevertheless, because remember, pasham is nothing else but the wool of the Tibetan antelope. And tush is the underbelly of that wool, the brownish thing. But the price commanded by these woolen shawls and objects is due to the fineness of the weaving technique, not the quality of wool itself. So dyeing techniques, etc., in those days, I think in those days the raw wool was brought to the mandis in Haldwani and given to various other places where people just brought up the wool. For example, there used to be these mills in Ludhiana called the Dhariwal mills, you know, and these Dhariwal mills, Elgin mills or Dhariwal mills, they bought up bulk wool from the Bhotias. So the Bhotias traded as far as Ludhiana, as far as, Amritsar. But they gave the wool itself, not the made objects, or I mean, not the made clothing. So the dyeing was not needed then. For their own personal uses, of course, they used only vegetable dyes in those days. But their own personal use, the clothing was not of a high sophisticated category that they needed to go in for more bulk dyes or larger quantities of dyes. That would be a home dyeing technique. And probably they use the barks of trees or of some root vegetables to color the garments that they wove for their own selves. These were not traded, these were not commercial garments. So I think dyes is something that doesn't play a very large role. Today, of course, the shawls that are made in the panchachuli mills, etc., they're using chemical dyes, not vegetable dyes.
Thank you for that. And now we have Aman Panta with his question.
Hello, ma'am. My question is to you that I want to know that under the colonial rules, there is any change in the nature of the trade in this whole region, or particularly you are talking about the Bhotia communities, like you are
Yes,
talking about the
yes. There was a
Bhotia
change.
community.
Yeah,
So I
I
want to,
mentioned
yeah.
I mentioned that the British started the manufacture of salt.
Yeah.
Salt has played an important role in our history, especially with the Gandhiji's Dandi March and so on and so forth. So the
Hmm.
manufacture of salt in a cheaper and more commercial way changed the whole nature of the trade. And therefore, the Kumaon Hills were no longer dependent, at least that part of North India was not dependent on Tibetan salt. And the salt mines, as somebody asked, I think Aniket asked, the salt mines in Tibet are, there are various mines, but in that plateau, not very far from the Taklakot Mandi and others, from where they procured this salt. So then it came to borax, I mentioned, the smelting, where borax was used for smelting. And I told you that it was exported also to European countries. But when then again borax became more easily available, then it got into commonplace goods. Even before they were commonplace goods, but the money earner or the money spinner used to be the salt and the borax. But now it became other things. I mentioned to you earlier that, even the Tibetan lamas were asking for motorcycles and 555 cigarettes and maybe, for all you know, imported whiskey and whatnot. And vice versa, because it's a landlocked country, they would not have been able to get it other than the Bhotia traders. So, and here we got other things from them. Mostly they needed our grain, they needed our food supplies, especially grain. And that was something supplied by the Bhotias. Did I answer your question, Aman?
No, exactly. So when we are talk about the trade with the Tibet, so basically that there is so many communities like Bhotias. There is also Laulis, and there is also Ladakhi and the Kinoras as well, who
But
are
those are different
engaged in
valleys.
the, yeah. There is
That's
in the
not
whole,
Kumaoni Bhotias.
no, they, all these communities are involved in the trans Himalayan trade basically,
Yes,
and they are
yes.
actually, Yeah, they are actually under the colonial rule. There are so many changes in their nature of the trade and the goods they are transporting from the Tibet and
Absolutely.
yeah. So
Absolutely.
in
But
that way,
Aman,
I want to know the what kind of changes came into the nature of the trade with the when earlier they are involved in the salt
Aman,
trade and other.
yeah,
So
I
now they
understand.
are they change themselves with the wool trade and etc.
Yeah, yeah.
So my
Aman,
question is like,
if you see my documentary, it has 3 or 4 documents that are pasted on it. I could not retrieve those documents from that documentary because I don't know the technology of how to do it. But those documents gives you a very clear, taken from the archives, how much trade, what goods are traded, what year they're traded, what's the value, how many lakhs of rupees, etc. It gives you a sampler. So watch the documentary and you will get the answer to your question with reference to these particular valleys. With reference to Lahore and the rest of the Himalayas, that's a very wide thing. I cannot generalize on that. But obviously, this would be symptomatic of exactly what was happening there also. So the documentary is called They Who Walk the Himalayas. It gives you all the secondary sources and primary sources to my research, as well as it gives you the documentation of trade comparisons and nature of changes in the kind of goods that were traded. Does that answer your question?
yeah, thank you. And the last one is what is the name of the book you mentioned by the Vanita? Something, some by the.
Vinita Poon is called Living on the Move.
Okay, living on the book. Thank you so
Yeah,
much.
she spent
Thank you
two
so
or
much.
three months with the Bhotias and
Okay,
traveled with them, their whole transhuman's way of life. I found it a very interesting book. I think she teaches in Australia, if I'm not mistaken.
okay. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank you, Aman, for your question. Do we have any more questions? If not, I can make an announcement. Next week, we have Christian Luxanitz, who is a senior lecturer in Tibetan and Buddhist art at the School of Oriental and African Studies. He will be talking about Alchi and the art there. So do not miss that lecture next weekend on Sunday at 7:30, December the 13th. And those of you who are joining us today, we hold these lectures every Sunday at 7:30. We took a brief hiatus last week, preparing because I was traveling and I couldn't be on a COVID flight with the internet and all of that. It would be too chaotic. So gave us a chance to rejuvenate. And next weekend we'll meet again. And again, the Himalayan Institute of Cultural and Heritage Studies stands for everything Himalayan. Everything Himalayan, passion, mountaineering, hiking, things that connect us through these passes, through our love, through our, ma'am would say, our karmic connection with the Himalayas. And today we got a chance to hear you talk about that deep connect that you have with the mountains and enlighten us all with your work. And we do want you to come back soon, maybe in January, with your work on Agni Yoga of Nicholas Roerich and your work in the Kumaon Himalayas. And I'm so grateful to all of you to have joined the Sunday evening. And I will be posting this week on our YouTube channel. So those of you who have missed part of it, or who want to share this talk with others, you can do that. And I will be posting the link to the documentary as well, so you can really appreciate the entire sequence of things that we've talked about in a visual kind of way. So thank you so much, ma'am. Have a wonderful night. And
Thank you for having me.
thank you. And we are going to have you again for sure.
Bye
Thank you.
bye.
Bye. Good
Thank you
night,
to the
everyone.
audience. Bye.
Thank you.
Wonderful session.
Very nice. Yeah.
Manjuji,
Manjuji, Padma here. It was fantastic. It was both visual, audio treat. Thank you so much.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Such a wonderful session.
Excellent.